but
all right, here we go. Well, welcome for those in attendance and online for to Adult Forum and today's topic on Christian nationalism. Extremely relevant, and I actually going to go out on a limb here. I don't even call it Christian nationalism. I refer to it as white Christian nationalism. I think is a more accurate description. Unsure if Byron's content will go into that a little bit, but both because it doesn't fit, from my understanding, the historic nature of God's work around the world through Christianity, and it is embraced almost exclusively by white evangelical churches and by white evangelical churches in America. In my own spiritual journey, as a religious education teacher abroad, I just had a little light bulb moment is if what I believe, does this work in every culture, in every nation? If I'm following Christ, is it adaptable? And if it wasn't, then I wanted to reassess, am I off somewhere? And again, I'm not the speaker, don't want to get ahead of Byron's content, but related to what we see happening in America, I don't even give it the benefit of the positive, what can be considered a positive or neutral term of Christian nationalism. I call it white Christian nationalism. Like I won't say the word Christian nationalism, but without putting white in front of it is my own experience. But anyway, that's the topic, a little bit of a primer here. We're glad that you're here as we start the school year and our Adult Forum series back. We'll say in general too, as we have this Adult Forum, involves Byron as well as anyone here. We are looking for some additional speakers. If you are a member, you have a topic. We have some slots open, and we would love to have you participate if you would like to lead on a topic, if you have a suggested topic, or if you know someone in the congregation that you feel like would be interested in leading, then we could do that as well. But today's speaker is Byron Borger. I'll read the standard introduction. Before opening the Hearts and Minds bookstore, Byron worked in college ministry for the Coalition for Christian Outreach and on staff at Emmanuel Presbyterian Church in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, as well as associate director of the Thomas Merton Center in Pittsburgh. He and his wife, Beth, opened Hearts and Minds, an independent bookstore in Dallastown, Pennsylvania in 1982. And besides managing the small town shop, he has served congregations, denominations, and organizations as conference booksellers. He has spoken extensively about relating Christian faith to society at clergy convocations, colleges, churches, retreats, and events. He's worked in social change organizations and has written for several print and online journals, including Comment and CPJ's Capital Commentary. They've set up large book displays at conferences, including the C.S. Lewis Institute, where I first met Byron in Washington, D.C. in the early 2000s. So it's been 20 plus years since then. I was just one of those many 20 or 30 somethings that came across Byron's, at the time, mobile bookstore and his wisdom. And that's our relationship goes back to that. He also edited a book for college graduates called Serious Dreams, Big Ideas for the Rest of Your Life. He reviews books regularly at Book Notes, the Hearts and Mind newsletter. He attends First Presbyterian Church in York, Pennsylvania. And whether you were here or not, I would say you want to sign up for the Book Notes newsletter. There won't be a better email in your inbox. It is the best review. It's free. And it is the best review because from my standpoint, this is the most well-read and one of the wisest individuals that I've ever come across in my life journey, and particularly in my Christian journey. And so, he's spoken several times and have had great feedback from your content, and even some already this morning that we're excited to have you here speak on Christian nationalism. Byron, all you.
Well, thank you, Doug, very, very much. And thank you, Nelson, for inviting me. You guys are just doing such a fine work there in your adult forums. It's an honor to be with you. If I lived nearby, my wife and I would be a part of your congregation, I think. I just like what we hear and the people we've met. Thank you for those that have subscribed to Book Notes, our Hearts and Minds bookstore newsletter. It is fun to get some orders. We do mostly mail order is mostly what we do. So yeah, we've been in a bit of an uproar here the last couple of days. My wife just got out of the hospital after having some surgery from breast cancer stuff, and we're doing okay. Another employee is also off with the foot surgery. So we've been honoring the surgeons in our lives this week. It's been tricky, but it's really good to be with you here. I've got about 3 hours worth of stuff, and so I'm going to talk fast and squeeze as much in as we can. Doug, your question about whether it's white Christian nationalism or just Christian nationalism is a great question, a great comment, a great contribution. I think you're probably right about most of that, although not entirely so. So we could use either phrase. We'll get into that a little. I want to start off just with this saying by St. Augustine. They asked him in the 3rd century once, he was an African bishop of the early church, and they asked him, how do you know who's like a true Christian or not? And he said something to the effect of, well, don't ask what people believe. Ask them what they love. Because actually, as Jamie Smith put it, you are what you love. We are what we desire. We are what you want. In the very beginning of the Gospel of John, after some early comments, Jesus asks the disciples, what do you want? And that is really ultimately a question that sort of serves as a backdrop for this new season of Christian education that we're not, I would assume, here at your congregation or at mine, wanting to just dump theological or sociological facts into your brain, but we want spiritual formation. We want our desires, our loves, what we want to be transformed so that we can have rightly ordered lives. And in a certain sense, that's sort of behind the story of what we might want to call Christian nationalism, because it's my sense that it's a disordered sort of love. A love for country, a love for, good government or what have you. These sort of things are not bad things to want. And so people want things. Sometimes you want the wrong thing. Sometimes you want the wrong things in the wrong way. Sometimes you want the right thing in the wrong way. So this sort of question, Augustine, remember that old Eddie Rabbit song, Looking for Love in All the Wrong Places? A deeply Augustinian song. So this question of what we love is sort of part of this question below the hood of some of our conversations. What does it mean to calibrate the things that we desire in the right kind of way that would be godly? Okay, so that's just a first little opening comment. Much of the story of Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism is rooted in a bigger backstory. And so we're going to have to kind of allude to history a bit, especially a few key moments and eras that sort of tell the story of why we got into this mess with Pentecostal Christians blowing shofars on August 6th as they storm and destroy the Capitol. The telling of their story animates so much of the white Christian nationalist movement these days. So we need a big picture view, and we'll try to do a little of that. I'm sure some of you are specialists that know this stuff better than I do. As a Christian bookseller, we've met all kind of people in all kind of places, seen a lot of disordered loves in our own lives and amongst the different groups we serve. So I know a little of this firsthand, actually. Not all, but much of the ideology of Christian nationalism is obviously about the role of the state or the government. And Christian politics is sort of the bigger backstory or the adjacent story to this. What does it mean to think Christianly about government? And my sense is that what they're trying to do with Christian nationalism ends up making an idol out of the nation state and out of particular understanding of the nation state and a particular tribe, mostly white people within that nation state. And so they make all kind of disordered idols where they've made certain things that are legitimate the ultimate. And so anytime you've sort of made something that's a good thing in life, whether it's friendship or marriage or status or power or sex or anything, a good gift of God, but you make it some kind of an ultimate, that becomes a sign of idolatry. And of course, a fundamental sin within the Christian faith, a disorder of everything when you've made something into an idol. So talking about politics well is not itself a problem. Talking about patriotism wrong, I don't think is necessarily a problem. It's how they kind of get there and what they do with all that. Years ago, I was working with an organization. I hope some of you work with this organization called Bread for the World. It lobbies government with citizen action. It just invites citizens to get involved in government action. for the sake of the poor and the oppressed, one of the main themes of the entire Bible. And so working with the poor, whether it's foreign aid in Africa, say, or whether it's food stamps and SNAP and stuff like that, they look at legislation that's happening, and then they invite ordinary citizens by their church groups to get involved and lobby their local congresspeople. Well, I had organized a forum with a candidate who was in politics at the time, who I knew well, an evangelical Christian. I've shared pulpits with him. He's preached at churches. He's a good guy. And another guy that was running against him, who I did not know and was not known in the church world. At this forum, we asked him all kind of odd questions about, foreign aid and international debt and stuff, arcane questions about economics. And then at the end, we said, we're a religious group, a faith-based group. And so we just, for the record, we're just wondering what Bible verses, if any, might shape your work as a congressperson. Well, the guy that didn't go to church, I guess he was not a Christian, he piped up and he said, I don't know anything about the Bible really, but I'm sure there's something in the Bible about honesty. I'd say I'm going to be an honest candidate. I thought, okay, he took a crack at it. That's not bad. And then the other guy, who was the Christian, the leader, the preacher, good congressman in Washington for a good number of years, he said, could you repeat that question, Byron? I said, what Bible verses, if any, are going to shape your work as a congressman? Well, he asked a third time, and then I was kind of annoyed. And he finally said, I've been asked a lot of questions in my day, but I've never really thought about that. And I thought to myself, how do you be a professional, educated leader who's devoutly Christian and not once in your whole career think about if the Bible says anything about your work? How is there such a big Sunday, Monday gap, a missing gap between Sunday and Monday, between liturgy and life, between prayer and politics? He just couldn't bring this together. And afterwards, he came up to me and he said, I've never thought of that. I thought my own kids could have said Psalm 72 or Romans 13 or Isaiah 58 or Leviticus 25. I mean, there's all kinds of verses that talk about justice and so forth and the task of the state. So it seems to me that the fundamental problem with all of us is sort of a lack of a seamless life where we actually naturally integrate our faith into all that we do. And so there's consequently a gap between heart and mind, between Sunday and Monday, between worship and work. And so narrowing that gap is a good thing. That's the problem with Christian nationalism, is that they have this kind of dualism that hasn't allowed them in history to think well about Christian politics. Now they're starting to, and I think they're getting it all wrong. But the fact that they're attempting to bring faith into the public square is not in itself the problem. Some people would say, oh, church and state, this is undemocratic, you shouldn't do that. I sort of, with all kind of qualifications, want to applaud an effort to think faithfully about public life, to think Christianly about influence, to serve the common good and the order of the commonwealth. Like, that's not a bad thing in principle. Just wanted to say that right from the start. Many of the advocates of Christian nationalism obviously bring the Bible to faith in politics, but it is in my contention that they're not doing it in a faithful way that's thought out, that stands in theological substance, that's in the tradition of the best thinkers of this stuff through church history. It's not theologically sound or biblically rooted. So they're not thinking Christianly about government or politics or the state or the vocation of citizens or civic life. But they're giving it a shot. So I'll just say that in the beginning. Kudos to them for at least attempting to get out of the streets and out of the pews and into the streets, so to speak. Well, what it does look like to do it faithfully is a whole nother class and a whole nother course, and that's a whole nother topic. But for now, we'll at least try to analyze sort of what went wrong in their good effort to relate faith and politics. And that is, just to be clear, again, my effort is, my complaint is not that they're attempting to relate faith to public life, but that their politics and citizenship approach is just wrong. Okay, just wanted to say that in the beginning. So it's not primarily, I want to say this too, primarily about Donald Trump or his current administration or his particular policies, although there's huge overlap. His MAGA movement is not entirely the same as Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism. Some of his supporters are just ordinary citizens who, for various reasons, I don't know, don't like Democrats or Democratic politics or what they call liberals. And some of that is what I would call, just ordinary citizens trying to make up their mind. Good people can disagree about stuff. Some who support Trump, I believe, are driven by very disordered, sinful values, hatred for immigrants, overt racism. You think of some of his people who have done Hitler salutes and all that sort of stuff. So there is a very dark side to the MAGA movement. And I think even honest conservatives have to be honest about that the MAGA movement has picked up some really unsavory ideologies and people, whether it's, Linda Looper and her neo-Nazi stuff, or whether it's the Proud Boys. But in any case, Christian nationalism is yet another movement that precedes Donald Trump. So that's, I guess, my first point, is that it's not necessarily about MAGA, and it's not necessarily about Trump, although they've been influenced by Christian nationalists. But the movement of Christian nationalism, I think, precedes Trump. It's an odd and complicated aspect that, get this, not everybody who we talk about Christian nationalism is even a Christian. There are people that like the ideas of Christian nationalism who don't view themselves as followers of Jesus. And then there are people who follow Christian nationalism who are pretty straight in their faith lives, pretty ordinary, decent Christians, theologically sound, and they just got this weird, disordered view of government that's a bit idolatrous. And then there's other people whose theology is way off the charts weird. And there is just, again, honest people in the Christian right have got to admit that there's some of their leaders are really off the edge into some very peculiar views theologically. So there's all kind of complicated stuff. Some Christian nationalists aren't Christians. Some are Christians who might be fairly normal, and some are Christians that are really out there. So we just have to, again, admit that it's a pretty complicated thing, and that's just sort of part of the sociological makeup of these guys. The big point that I want to make, again, I mean, this could be a whole course, is that these ideologies that have shaped Christian nationalism have become idols. And I've already said that, but the Bible is monotheistic and it is missional. It is designed to have people of God introduce the goodness of our monotheistic triune God into the world. John Calvin said that the heart is an idol-making factory. And so this charge of serving false gods, which is going to be my main concern, that they're false, disordered loves that leads to false ideologies, which leads to idols, that is not just sort of an arrogant, self-righteous pointing the finger at them, because we all do that. We've all got broken, looking for love in all the wrong places. We all got broken theories. We all have ideology we serve. Romans 12 says, don't be conformed to the ways of this world. But we've all allowed the world to squeeze us into its mold way too often. We haven't developed the Christian mind adequately. So I'm not just pointing my fingers at them, because we all have got this problem of having a heart that often strays, that is prone to wonder, that is an idol-making factory, like Calvin said. So we're all in this same boat together. It's the human condition. They particularly run with this without much self-awareness and without any sense of repentance of the idolatry of the nation state. Okay. So when a communally shared worldview, a set of assumptions like this, these core assumptions and disordered values, become a system of thought, I want to call that an ideology. So again, like just for example, patriotism isn't a bad thing, to care for your country, to care for your people. Richard Mouw has a little book that even implies it's a way to love your neighbors, to care about your place, and to honor your own government. Nothing wrong with that. But when it becomes elevated to become some sort of exceptional key point of your worldview, all that you begin to put your eggs in that basket, it becomes an ideology, and then that ideology drives idolatry. There's a great book called Here Are Your Gods. Doug asked if I'd mentioned some books. Here Are Your Gods. It's by Christopher Wright, who's a great missionary theologian, lives in England. Here Are Your Gods. The subtitle is Faithful Discipleship in Idolatrous Times. He studies the notion of idolatry in the first half, and then he looks at political and civic ideologies that can be idolatrous in the second half, and what it means. He's not really looking at MAGA necessarily, or even Christian nationalism, but just the idolatries of nation states. This is my favorite book to kind of begin to get at some of those conversations. It looks at the political arena, God's people in an idolatrous world. There's another book I'll recommend that begins to frame some of this question of idolatry, and I love the title because it just says much. It's by a guy named Drew Strait. He's a Mennonite, and the book is called Strange Worship. That's a line from Scripture, but isn't that interesting? A strange worship. The subtitle is 6 Steps for Challenging Christian Nationalism. He's a Mennonite, and so he brings some direct action, Martin Luther King, nonviolent commitments to the common good and the beloved community. And the sixth chapter is about what local congregations can do. It's really useful. But this notion of a strange worship is, again, just a way to sort of get at the part of the conversation. There's a book called American Heresy: The Roots and Reach of White Christian Nationalism. And again, it is calling it an American heresy. Idolatry of the nation state and this weird particular assumption that white people and white people's power is sort of privileged is not only a Christian heresy, but it's also an American heresy, because it isn't really good for our own best views of our country. The Roots and Reach of White Christian Nationalism is by John Fanistel. Published by Fortress Press, which is Lutheran. It is really a useful thing. He's from the where is he? He's a United Methodist. I was thinking he was down your way. No, but he might be out in California. But Fanistel's American Heresy. So again, we're setting the stage here by saying we have to look at the big picture. We have to look at idolatry. And part of the history of the rise of this ideology that leads to idolatry is that it is somehow a heresy. Okay, so that's sort of my background to get us going into this. Here's quickly now what I mean by white Christian nationalism and where it came from. I'm going to list a couple of key points, and most of you probably know all this, but I'll just list it for your convenience. One easy book that gets at this is called American Christian Nationalism, Neither American Nor Christian, by Mike Austin. Michael Austin's a fine, thoughtful ethicist, has written a number of books, but this little short guy is easy to read. But he says that this is sort of the configuration of what you might want to say are the idols or the ideology, the main claims of Christian nationalism. First is that America is founded as a Christian country. This is sort of the assumption of most Christian nationalists, is that the history of America is distinctively Christian. And of course, most of you probably know this, you're smart people, that this is just frankly wrong. America had great Christian leaders in its earliest days and Christian political thinkers in its earliest days. Some were anti-Christian. Some were maybe Christian in parts of their life, but not in other parts of their life. In other words, it was a mixed bag. Some people say, yes, it was clearly a Christian country. I think they're wrong. Some say, no, not at all. And that's pretty wrong, too. We're not just Enlightenment rationalists and deists. There were what we might today somewhat call traditionally Orthodox Christians in the mix as well. My friend John Thea, who until just recently taught at Messiah College near us, has a book called Was America Founded as a Christian Country? And very esteemed, very thoughtful historian, looking carefully at the colonial documents. And he says, yes, no, and maybe. Some people were Christians, some weren't. Some had a Christian worldview but didn't live it. Some had a Christian sort of sense of things, but big blind spots like slavery. So the assumption of Christian nationalism is just a blunt, historically challengeable assumption, and it's even more than assumption, a doctrine that America was a Christian country. Again, this John Fanistel that wrote American Heresy is a great book to read about the mixed bag of the founding fathers and the counter voice to say, no, it was not a Christian country. Let's just be honest about the documents from John Locke and the founding fathers and what they believed, what they did, and so forth. So that sort of assumption that America was once a Christian country is rock bottom important for the Christian nationalists. Of course, then you're also going to realize eventually that we've lost that, and so they want to return to it. When we say make America great again, some people mean some things by that, but some Christian nationalists, particularly the white Christian nationalists, would want to say what we want to return to is something like the founding fathers or the original proclamations of the founding fathers. So that's rock bottom for them. That the government of the U.S. then should promote a certain sort of Christian culture, not even just any Christian culture, but a particularly conservative, evangelical, narrow focused that they think emerged from the founding fathers. So if the founding fathers created a Christian country, a conservative Christian country, then therefore it's the task of the government now to protect, promote, sometimes by force of law, sometimes just by custom, to enhance and protect that Christian culture. It moves toward defending and promoting and privileging a certain sort of Anglo-Protestant, what we might today call an evangelical or fundamentalist view of the Christian faith. And again, this is for the common good of all, they think. because it's what the founders initially brought over here. So that's a second key point, that we're a Christian country and it's the task of the state to make sure it stays that way. And they define that by privileging a certain very narrow sort of the Christian faith, which we today might want to call it evangelical fundamentalism, even though the founders didn't use that particular language. Americans should pursue political power. American Christians should promote and pursue political power so we can take dominion over a country that no longer does that. That's the third big point, is that it's the Christian's job to return America to this Christian country we once had, and to privilege Christians for the sake of everybody. It just works well for everybody if you do that, if you enhance Christian values. And so there, it's our job to take dominion, and different people mean different things by that. But again, by force of law, we should begin to influence government. Now, again, as I've said, I don't think it's a bad thing to want to be salt and light in the world, to love our neighbors by demanding political justice in the Commonwealth. So again, I'm not opposed to their desire to say Christian people should love our neighbors well by being people of justice in the public square. Not a problem with that. But their particular understanding of it is we take dominion, not that we serve or influence, or that we're a city on a hill or light or leaven, but that we actually conquer. It's this Christian model that assumes, like the Crusades, we have to take over and capture the enemies who have taken over the American nation. So the sub-story of the enemies that have ruined it, that we have to do battle with them, kick them out, and retake the government for the sake of the kingdom of God. Guys like Sean Foyt, he's a praise and worship leader, long blonde hair. Maybe you've seen pictures of him, and he shows up at these protests to sing praise and worship songs. He says believers should be writing the laws, because the kingdom is the government. The kingdom of God is the government. I'm not exactly sure what he means by that, but he clearly means that it's not that we are citizens who are committed to church and as followers of Jesus try to be salt and light in the world, but that we need to take over, write the laws, because that's where the kingdom of God will be seen when the state becomes like the church in a certain sense. They sometimes talk about wanting a Christian prince. That's language from Machiavelli. It's also language from even all the way back to Luther. But this notion that there needs to be somehow a Christian leader, a strong man, they sometimes call it, which sounds authoritarian and even fascist at times. They need a strong man to stomp out the chaos. So this is not just sort of speculation or some liberal critique. They say this in their writings, in their sermons, in their books, and there's oodles of them, radio talk shows. It's a fairly sophisticated network of conservative, some of them call themselves apostles. We'll talk about that in a minute. But this notion that we need to write the laws, we need a Christian prince who's a strong man who can reconquer the government to get back to the way it used to be when we were a truly Christian country, privileging certain kind of Anglo-Protestant evangelicals. And so the third point is that American Christians should pursue political power, because that's the way we regain dominion over the culture that's going to hell in a handbasket. They want power, but not necessarily, I don't think, public service. They want power, and therefore the notion of pluralism that's rooted in the best of the American tradition, that we are a pluralistic country and everybody gets their fair share, that everybody's equal under the law, is really not in their vocabulary at all. Pluralism, or a diversity of political views that wager good conversations in the public square, is simply not part of their conversation of the Christian nationalists. America, another, should prioritize America's own self-interest. Our foreign policy is not so interesting to them, and unless it's supporting Israel, and we don't really prioritize interest over other nation states. Trump used early on the language of America first. Any historians in the room remember that that was a movement back during World War I, America First, which was isolationist. Some pacifists liked that, but actually it wasn't rooted in an ethical love for neighbor or enemy, a desire to be peacemakers in the world, or the ethics of nonviolence. It was really just an American exceptionalism that said we should be first, and we put ourselves first by ignoring everybody else. But that's pretty much a tenet of most white Christian nationalists, is that in terms of foreign policy, America must prioritize America. So what they've done now in this is they've begun to fuse your American identity with your Christian identity, and its adherents really sort of blend faith and politics in that kind of odd way, so that to be an American means you really are a good Christian. If you're an American, you're a Christian. Or if you're a Christian, you're a good American. Doug mentioned a global understanding of the missional faith and living overseas, and there's many Christians in the global South and so forth. The Christian nationalists, by and large, although they are networked globally with some other fascist regimes, their view of the best sort of Christian there is not driven by Africa or whatever. It's driven by Washington. So to be a good Christian, you have to be a good American. They fused the identity. Let me just read a little paragraph from this Michael Austin book that I mentioned called American Christian Nationalism. He's quoting a book called The Power Worshippers, which is a book that's very, very important by a woman named Catherine Stewart. And he quotes her in this book. And rather than reading the Catherine Stewart part, I'll just read it from this book. He says, finally, in her book, The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, Catherine Stewart argues that the ultimate goal of the Christian nationalist movement in America is power. She writes, it does not seek to add another voice to the American pluralistic democracy, but to replace our foundation democratic principles and institutions with a state grounded on a particular version of Christianity, answering to what some adherents call a biblical worldview that also happens to serve the interests of its plutocratic funders and allied political leaders. Austin says, I both suspect and fear that she is right. So she is saying that what ultimately, I think she's a little cynical in this, and she's not a person of Christian faith. So I'm not sure she understands fully the rise of charismatic renewal and so forth, and the Jesus movement of the 60s that gave rise to some of this stuff. But she is very cynical and says ultimately what the Christian nationalists want is power. And they want to do away with a pluralistic sort of institutional voice of American democracy and return to some sort of domineering prince. And to get that, we need power. And so power then needs to play footsie with the funders of the movement. And so it needs to commit themselves to do whatever the funders want. It becomes really odd how these evangelical, waving the Bible, blowing shofars, singing praise songs at the rallies end up being funded by the Koch brothers or the Coors brothers. You know, these people that do not have a traditional church-going evangelical Christian experiences, the people on the far dark right are funding these guys blowing their shofars and raising their hands at Trump rallies. So it's a really curious thing now how power and money have become a sort of subtext too to the rise of this odd new Christian right. Let me just kind of real quickly highlight where I think some of this comes from. There's all different sorts of Christian nationalism. There's different kinds of white Christian nationalism, and I'm going to just highlight some of where it came from. Then we'll stop for a minute and chat just a bit more. First, I want to say this, and I can't dwell on this. It's a whole other class, but there is, I'm sure you've heard of it, a papal bull, a papal document made in 1452 by Pope Nicholas V. I had to look it up because I wasn't sure I remembered the number. Nicholas V in 1452 called the Doctrine of Discovery. And the Doctrine of Discovery, there's lots of books about this now, basically said when the conquistadors went out, if the country had not been discovered by the church yet, you could make it Christian by default. And so it gave the right to discover lands and declare they were part of the regime of the Catholic Church. This, of course, led to not only just sort of the dark side of colonialism and settlerism, but to actual genocide. The conquistadors and the genocide of South and North America has as its motivating theological foundation this doctrine of discovery. I think in a certain sense, that's part of the roots of the Christian nationalism. That we as people who are Christians, now mostly Protestants, but also some Catholics, want to conquer in the name of Jesus. And so anything we can get our hands on, we're going to make it Christian by coercion. And we're authorized to do that in the name of God. So the theological doctrine of discovery is behind this big time, I believe. Secondly, this. Think of the Puritans and the Pilgrims. Again, classes have been taught on this, books have been taught on this, but just think of guys like John Cotton and John Withrop and the experience at Jamestown, or the Massachusetts Bay Colony, William Bradford's famous speeches, the Mayflower coming over, the stuff about being a shining city on a hill. There was amongst these Puritans in England first, wanting a purified church away from the Catholic takeovers and some of the shoddy theology of the Anglicans, or at least the practices, these righteous reformers, some of who wrote deeply rich stuff, some of this Puritan stuff, often began to think of their purified church using texts from the Old Testament about the Hezekiah and the renewal of the kingdoms and so forth during the divided kingdoms and so forth. And they began to view themselves as the people of Israel. And when they fled the persecution in England to come to the free states, they began to view North America, and particularly their role in North America, as the nation of Israel. And so in the history of American political theory, there is this very persuasive, very pervasive, I should say, connection of America as God's nation, as a Christian country. This precedes the Declaration of Independence and the 1700s founding fathers. This precedes that, but this language of a Christian nation that had sort of through the doctrine of an evangelical version of the doctrine of discovery, the Pilgrims and the Puritans blended America with the ancient Israel. They began to talk about Exodus in that way, God parting the seas and us being set to a new land. The notion of conquest then, just like the early Jews conquering the land of Jericho and so forth, that becomes part of the American war against the Indians. The notion of a monarchy in the Old Testament. And so this blurring of assumptions that America is a Christian country because we're the people of God in this new rugged land, that is absolutely from these early Pilgrims and Puritans of the earliest days, and gave a theological defense for colonialization. When people want to criticize Christopher Columbus, the Christian right goes crazy. The Christian nationalists go crazy when we start saying, but yeah, these guys killed Indians. They were sometimes gracious and many times not. They enslaved people from Africa eventually. And you raise those questions of this dark side of American history, and people just go nuts. And it's the sign of an idol or an ideology that's idolatrous when you can't poke at it at all, even with just non-negotiable facts that we killed native indigenous people and that we enslaved black people and that was horrendous. You can't even say that to them and they go crazy. They say, we're revising history. Of course we're not revising history. Those are facts. They're revising history to cover it up. But because it's idolatrous, you can't say that to them or they go wild. So this American as a Christian nation preceding the 1776 situation, going back to the colonial era of the period of John Cotton and John Withrop, and the Pilgrims and the Puritans. That's really important stuff. And get this, many of the people then that fought in the war of the 1776, this is real important. Many of the people that fought, the colonialists in New England that fought in the war of 1776, they viewed themselves as the spiritual descendants of the Glorious Revolution. You know, the battle with William and Mary in England that restored the English monarchy to Protestant rule. This was like 1688 or something. And then they made the Protestant Bill of Rights, the English Bill of Rights in 1689 that allowed Protestants to have certain privileges over against the Catholic monarchy. You kind of understand why that was, because they were repressed by the Catholics. So the Glorious Revolution in the 1680s happened, and it began to assert Protestant privilege in England, and the Revolutionary War soldiers viewed themselves as the spiritual descendants of William and Mary fighting for Protestant privilege. So when Americans now in the 2000s talk about a Christian nationalism, whether they even know it or not, they're in the spiritual lineage of the Revolutionary War soldiers who talked about William and Mary and the glorious revolution of England. I just think that's a really important part of the history of this. So the colonial era, the doctrine of discovery, the glorious revolution in England. Of course, then you could jump ahead and look at the resurgence. This is really important too. The resurgence of extreme racism, particularly after the Civil War, and then the time of Jim Crow in the 1915, I guess, when the Ku Klux Klan had its second resurgence. It was big after the Civil War, kind of got stomped out, sort of disappeared for a while. And then there was a movie, a silent film called Birth of a Nation. You've heard of it. And it painted the KKK in very favorable, patriotic Christian light. And so KKK started again. There was a particular guy in the state of Indiana that began to reestablish. They used modern recruiting methods, and it became much, much bigger than it was after the Civil War. This is the 1915 to 1925, basically. The KKK was at its height, became known for being nativist, terribly against anybody that wasn't white, and certainly against immigrants. It was against Catholics. It was against Jewish people. And so you have kind of almost the template of what becomes Christian nationalism, because they portrayed themselves as true Americans and as true patriots. So the rise of the Klan, inspired by the Birth of the Nation, and this 1915 guy, Simmons was his name, who reestablished a new, popular, patriotic version of the Klan, not quite as rough and rowdy as they were after the Civil War, but much more sophisticated and modern and contemporary and positive and waving American flags, because the best of Americanism is nativism, anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, of course, anti-Black, and restoring true American patriotism to the conversation. This, of course, after Reconstruction, it was bad, but it glorified that era, and then using aggressive modern recruiting tactics just exploded. It was no longer confined to the South, was biggest in the Midwest, even here in Pennsylvania, so much so that by the 1980s, we opened our bookstore here, lobbied for making Martin Luther King Day a national holiday. Christian leader, committed to nonviolence, what's not to love? And so I wanted the King Day to be a holiday, and we were lobbying for that, and we began to get death threats under the store or door of our bookstore here from the local Ku Klux Klan chapter. So the Klan was again in its rise in the 80s and 90s, along with other neo-Nazi kind of groups. There's kind of conversations now, people that infiltrate the Klan begin to study that between how neo-Nazi they want to be. There's some that are the sort of old school Klan and mostly anti-Black. And then there's these neo-Nazi versions that are kind of make the Klan almost look like kid stuff. But that's sort of part of the Christian nationalist movement, is this renaissance of the KKK. And that's why Doug is right to call it white Christian nationalism, because that at that point then is, it just happened to be white people in New England, but they didn't make their whiteness part of the ideology of the Christian nation with the Pilgrims and the Puritans. But by the early 1900s, the whiteness was absolutely part of the Christian nationalism. And so from that point on, I think Doug's right that we should call it white Christian nationalism. And they were promoting what they called 100% Americanism. And it was a phrase that the KKK used, 100%, and white supremacy becomes part of that. Interestingly enough, there is a, parenthetically, sort of a mood within Christian nationalists nowadays in the last decade or so that talks less about race and more about gender. Concern about traditional moms. There's websites about trad moms, they call them traditional moms. You know, bros that are all about masculinity and so forth. There's so much written about true masculinity, driven by a fear of LGBT people and gender questions, particularly trans people. A trans person was beat up on the streets of York in our town here last week, just beat up terrible for no good reason. And so this fear of gender questions is driving white Christian nationalists now, and almost any white Christian nationalist program or Trump rally you go to, there's going to be anti-gay stuff, very prevalent now, almost in a way that anti-Black stuff used to be in earlier days. Another important part of the contemporary white Christian nationalist movement emerged in the 1950s and early 60s, and it was a concern about an overreach of the government, which is a line they always use, kind of the overstatement of too much government, when the feds forced racial integration at Little Rock and in the Deep South. And so the use of the government and federal forces to insist that there be national legislation against discrimination becomes a huge backdrop of what Christian nationalists despise. The government forcing people to do racial reconciliation. They don't go for that at all. It's a critique of both big government and a critique of anything that would erode white supremacy. And you combine those two things, and you end up with this anti-government thing that comes to its highlight in people like Ronald Reagan. Said the most dangerous words in Western history is, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." You know, that the only kind of good government is a small government. That anti-government tone began particularly in the 50s around the civil rights question. So it combined white supremacy with anti-government and anti-federal overreach, as they would say. And then, of course, you have in the Reagan era, you also have the Tea Party that became very rowdy, very anti-government, very forceful in cynically exposing both Republicans and Democrats that they didn't like. And so this movement of the conservative wild right becomes part of the Christian nationalist backdrop. Bradley Onishi has a book called Preparing for War, and it's a study of the history of nationalism, white nationalism. He was part of that for years, came out of it and wrote this book called Preparing for War. And he says those of us that are now concerned about resisting this stuff have to realize that they have been at this, preparing for this war for 60 years. And they form networks and think tanks and communication infrastructure. It's not just an idea or an ideology, but it's a movement. It's a well-organized movement full of infrastructure and networks. And he said they've been at it for 60 years. So Bradley Onishi, in his Preparing for War, is a sort of study of the systematic and sophisticated networks of all these folks. I mentioned Catherine Stewart, who wrote, and by the way, the Preparing for War by Bradley Onishi is the extremist history of white Christian nationalism and what comes next. That's his Preparing for War. I mentioned Catherine Stewart, and I quoted from her book a little while ago. Her newest is called Money, Lies, and God. And she connects the think tanks and the movement that's funding the disinformation that's pushed out by the religious people. This Money, Lies, and God is so important. It's inside the movement, which she says is designed to destroy American democracy and pluralism. Again, she's particularly cynical about this and waves a red flag. I'm not sure she's wrong, but she's not sort of looking at the religious earnestness of some of these folks, but the sort of corruption of much of it. And what she does in this book is she describes what she calls funders, thinkers, sergeants, infantry, and power players. That's the 5 layers of folks, the funders, the thinkers, the sergeants, the infantry, and the power players in Washington. And she kind of divides up this movement of nationalism and white Christian nationalism and the far extremist right, and how they combine and who funds them and who runs their think tanks, the Claremont Institute, the Heritage Institution, and so forth. So this is a really interesting study of the infrastructure with tons of stories of her embedded, lots of church services and MAGA stuff, speaking in tongues, all kind of things. Fascinating Catherine Stewart book. I highly recommend that as well for details. Hey, by the way, when you think of thinkers and people of the 60s and the people that were frustrated about American overreach around the civil rights question, think also then of that era of the anti-communism movement during the beginning of the Cold War. You know, we're in a different era now with Putin and Afghanistan and so forth, and terrorists and jihadists. We're in a different mood, but the kind of framework of the Cold War stuff, the McCarthy era, the canceling people that even said anything different, that Cold War era anti-communism stuff is part of it. And one of the great figures in that is a woman named Phyllis Schlafly, devout Catholic, brought faith into politics as an anti-communist. She actually studied the START talks and the strategic war initiatives, nuclear weapon stuff was her specialty until she became a pro-lifer and worked against abortion. There's a Netflix documentary, or not a Hollywood movie, a movie fictionalization of the life of Phyllis Schlafly that is tremendous to watch if anybody has seen it. Shows who Phyllis Schlafly was, her anti-Cold War stuff, her Cold War anti-communism, how that shaped then the rise of the first sort of version of the Christian right, which was Jerry Falwell, you know, Pat Robertson, those kind of guys, Ralph Reed, which the Moral Majority was founded in 1979, which would be the next level of backdrop of where Christian nationalism comes from, is the first iteration of what was called popularly the Christian right. The Christian right in those years, God and country mixed together, Christian identity, American identity, all the stuff we've said, an undertone of racism, although they weren't overt about it too often, but sometimes they were. This same stuff with Falwell and Pat Robertson was the first itineration of the Christian right. They were not charismatic or Pentecostal. They were anti that for the most part, except for Pat Robertson. They were sophisticated politically with guys like Ralph Reed, with fundraising and so forth. Um, the new version of that, in the new version of Christian nationalism, they have all been replaced by people like Paula White, who is one of the lead figures, a white televangelist in the prosperity movement, name it and claim it, offering blessing and prosperity, largely a pastor of Black churches. She viewed J.D. Jakes as her mentor in Florida. A white, thin woman, couple of times married, televangelist, TV talk show, multimillionaire eventually, running churches that were largely populated by Latinos and Blacks. Whites were in the minority of her churches, who eventually gets called by Trump. Trump likes Paula White a lot. His earlier televangelist was Norman Vincent Peale, very moderate, anti-communist, but pretty name it and claim it in the most simple sort of way of win friends and influence people, positive thinking. But Trump liked that positive thinking. He went to Norman Vincent Peale's church in New York, and he thought Paula White had that just ratcheted up, this positive thinking that God can make a difference in your life and change everything. And he calls Paula White out of the blue and asks if he could meet with her. She eventually becomes the first Pentecostal, name it and claim it, prosperity televangelist to work in the White House, becomes the head of her faith initiative in the first Trump years. So she has an office in the White House. One of the main things Paula White did in the White House was pray for people, and particularly pray prosperity prayers and calling in angels from Africa, for instance, or angels from South America. I didn't know there were angels in those places that Paula White could summon, but she would summon the angels to come from these places to surround and secure, as she put it, secure President Trump's efforts. And she had these phone lines of prayer people. She had a prayer call that she would do once a week, where they would speak in tongues and call forth angels and do spiritual warfare, as they call it, battling the territorial spirits. That's a line invented by Peter Wagner, that there are territorial demons that would keep people oppressed in certain areas, and there would be certain demons assigned to certain things, so you would have to do spiritual warfare against them. And so she would call certain people to pray against these territorial spirits. Well, guess what? Those prayer calls were used in the weeks before the January 6th insurrection to invite people to come to Washington. One of the main investigative efforts to help figure out who caused the January 6th uprising came from Paula White's Rolodex, from her spiritual warfare people that were being called regularly to fight the demons that were stopping Trump. And she would call anybody trying to stop Trump demonic. And that spiritual Pentecostal, they call themselves the New Apostolic Reformation, where prophets and apostles are appointed, people that can make predictions and prophesy stuff, people that could call forth with prophecy and with words of knowledge, miraculous power, and learn how to be spiritual warriors against anybody that was fighting against Trump. And so this white Christian nationalism comes to a head in our time, run not by the old school Christian right of Jerry Falwell, of just conservative Republican politicians that were anti-abortion and against big government and willing to go to battle with that the way Falwell did, but a much different sort of neo-Pentecostal, sometimes they don't believe the Trinity, they're kind of weird sometimes, people that are speaking in tongues over the president, blowing shofars, going on Jericho walks, singing praise songs to generate energy to fight against anybody that wouldn't put this strongman prince in power, to restore America to its colonial founding fathers' day that is not pluralistic, but more of a theonomy, almost like jihadists, not that they do too much violence, physical violence, but like the jihadists that want to, in the name of God, set up a theocracy of a Christian nation state. They call that dominion, taking dominion. Now, not everybody that's a Christian nationalist believes in dominionism, and not everybody that's a Pentecostal fighting for Trump is part of the new apostolic reformation. There are all kind of sub themes that overlap. The absolute best book, absolutely thrilling book that explains all this new religious Pentecostal stuff and how it's taken over the old Christian right, is a book called The Violent Take It by Force. It's a mysterious verse that Jesus said more largely about the Herod persecution when they killed John the Baptist. And he's making a reference to the bad guys in the Herod influence that killed his cousin John. And he said, the violent take it by force. They use that as a prescriptive statement, not a prescriptive statement, but as a command that we need to use spiritual violence to unseat those that have taken over America and ruined it and return the dominion back to the Christian principles. And so the violent take it by force. This guy who used to be part of this movement, his name is Matthew Taylor, and is a journalist. He lives in Baltimore. This is by far the best book understanding the new version of Christian nationalism, not just white Christian nationalism of the KKK sort or of the Cold War sort or of the Christian right sort with Falwell. This is a new spiritually driven movement that used, he said, this slogan from Matthew, the violent take it by force, was the #1 Bible verse quoted on January 6th. When you analyze all the tweets, and there's just so much data, but all the tweets and Facebook posts and Facebook comments from all the soldiers that were watching all this take place, most of the pro-Christian people that appreciated January 6th takeover used this verse. And so the violent take it by force, the subtitle is The Christian Movement Threatening a Democracy, and it's a propulsive, page-turning read that analyzes Paula White and all these different characters that we need to know about if we're going to understand this kind of new iteration of the extremist right that allows itself not only to be idolatrous in its understanding of the nation state and its own white supremacy movement, but also to then partner with people that can help you do this, even if they're neo-Nazis. These guys are so undiscriminating about stuff and so bizarre in so much of their faith practices, but they are really a major, major force to be dealt with. And behind the scenes, the people funding them, the big players, and influencing people in politics. This is significant, significant stuff, and we need to know all this. So anyway, there's a lot more we could talk about. I promised I would leave some conversation time, some questions, and I haven't even gotten through all my notes. Man, there's so much more to say, but I'm hoping that this dominionism and stuff is at least a way to help you understand some of what we're up against when we look at the idols and the idolatrous ideologies of this new apostolic reformation that's trying to take dominion and destroy pluralism. Whew, that's a lot. Friends, sorry if I rambled on too much. What can we say in feedback, conversation about any of this, questions? Is this making sense?
Yes.
Wow. Yeah. My initial thought is that the former Archbishop of Canterbury is next, and I don't think in anything he could say or give can be as relevant as everything that you just said. So I think you might have upstaged him. He's speaking at Duke Chapel.
You're kidding. The Archbishop of Canterbury?
Yes. Yeah. But
Is your preacher today?
Correct. Yeah. But this, we've had more notes than I could possibly make and more questions in all of our heads. But the most important question is, or the comment to the class, please don't put those books in your Amazon cart.
No.
And Byron, can you please assemble a Christian nationalist reading package and present it to us? It can be like the book of 4, the 6, the whole package, and price it. And I, for one, will buy, and I know that others here also will. So can you get that to like Nelson and myself? I think you have my email. And then perhaps by next week, we can present it and we can continue this from here. Multiple other topics that have come to mind, and have almost all these books were new to me. And so thank you.
I would like very much to have an annotated list. I've listed some of these at book notes over the years. If you Google Christian nationalism or Christian politics in the search engine of my book notes, they're all archived and you can find some of these reviewed. But I'll make a list and I'll annotate them briefly, each one sort of the strengths and weaknesses of each one, and a bunch that I didn't mention. And I will absolutely get that to you sometime in the next week.
Sure. And could you price them out? Like, here's the 4-pack.
Yep, we'll do a discount on all of them. And I don't want you to buy a whole package or take them all. You can just pick 1 or 2 if they're useful. Maybe we'll do a package deal if you'd like. That's a good idea. But
I need the whole
your
package.
church library or something. These are going to be the top 10 that I most recommend. Yeah, absolutely. I can do that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. That might be the best use so that we can continue this. Multiple other topics. I think you're on the calendar throughout the year again to have you come back. But thank you so much. Absolutely fantastic. It definitely resonated with our group and as relevant a topic as we've ever had in this adult forum. And I feel like this is pretty relevant on most things. So thank you so much.
Well, it is complicated, and we can be simplistic and cynical in saying, oh, these bad Christians trying to take over the world. And it is more complicated than that. And the ideologies that shaped them over time with so many different of those influence I mentioned, I think that's a more nuanced way to sort of help us grapple with our brothers and sisters who have gone astray on these questions. Many of them are, in fact, devout, earnest Christians, and we want to honor their faith as we struggle together to figure out how to redirect some of their craziness.
So key because you're very gracious, but also that's the way to be able to see them as brothers and sisters and find some common ground and perhaps they can understand some of our perspective as well and consider the error of their ways. That's someone who used to be pretty well connected to the Heritage Foundation and other connections. The Phyllis Schlafly newsletter arrived at our house when I was a kid as well. I need to watch that one. So, well, thank you so much, Byron. Please join us next week when the Reverend Dr. Brett McKinley Purdue will inform us about holy friendships across traditions. And no kidding, Byron, we do have the former Archbishop of Canterbury in the service, so we're all headed in. It's been a great day at Duke Chapel. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay.
Thank you.